When it comes to creating narrative in video games, there are a whole host of different narrative devices to use. The most popular of these would probably be script writing. Cinematics, dialogue, interactive sequences, all use some form of script writing. Well, if that's something you're interested in, then I'd like to welcome you to a special edition of Dev Talk and Tea, where over the course of 3 videos, I'll be teaching you the basics of writing 3 different scripts: cinematics, interactive dialogue, and generic barks. Hi, I'm Ree, and welcome to part 1 of my scripting mini-series here on Dev Talk and Tea. As always, before we begin, let's spotlight our tea of the day. It is my go-to chai mix. It's nothing fancy, it's nothing special, but it gets the job done, and I do love a chai. So yeah, nothing fancy today, just my usual. If you have any tea recommendations though, I would love to hear them because I need to refill my cupboards. So today we are going to focus on writing scripts for cinematics or cutscenes. I'd say this style of script writing reflects a standard way of writing scripts you'd commonly see in film and television, though with some other considerations. Whilst there are plenty of wonderful, sophisticated writing tools and narrative tools, these tutorials are going to use free software like Google Docs as a template so that anyone can learn the process of script writing games without worrying about getting a subscription or learning the ins and outs of specific tools. All the scripts and the templates that you're going to see today will be linked down in the description below, free for anybody who wants to practice and explore game scripts. Without further ado, let's jump into our cinematic script. I sort of lied when I said let's jump into the script, because before we do, we need to understand what we want to achieve with this script. Cinematics in games have multiple purposes. It could be to provide exposition for the story, displaying character moments for character development, creating spectacle, or just delivering something that couldn't otherwise be achieved within gameplay. Whatever the reason, the first step is to create a brief for the cinematic to know what this cinematic is meant to achieve. This is not just for the narrative team, but for anybody who will have a hand in creating this cinematic, from paper all the way up to implementation in-game. Animators, musicians, actors, programmers all need to have a clear vision of what this should achieve so they can best input their experience to make it a reality. A virtual reality. Another thing to consider before we begin writing the script is how long we want this cinematic to be. This can depend on what you're wanting to achieve in the scene. Just keep in mind the audience you're writing for. Story-heavy games often have a lot of cinematic time allocated to them because it's a way of delivering the narrative in a cinematic way, but other genres might not lend themselves to having really long cutscenes. Of course, this all depends on the game you're making. And the last thing to consider is where the cinematic is meant to play. Ultimately, you want to be creating a satisfying flow between gameplay and cinematic, so just shoving in a cutscene somewhere without a thought might break immersion and even cause frustration. Consider where the best place would be to transition from gameplay to cinematic and vice versa, so that it is fun to experience. So for our test script today, our brief is to create a cinematic that introduces a new character, plays after a specific level titled Forest Combat A, where the player characters are beginning to get overwhelmed in the middle of combat. It ends loading in Forest Combat Level B, where the new character becomes a helpful NPC, and it should be no longer than 1.5 minutes runtime. You may want to add more detail here, depending on what else your script has to achieve. Maybe you want to clarify the tone or the emotional goal of the scene as well. But for now, we're just going to keep it real simple and test out this particular brief. Now, let's hop into the template. Alright, so at first glance, this doesn't look like much, but that's because the magic happens when you begin writing the scene you have in mind. So what we're looking on this first page here is basically all the logic that you need in order to create your script. So from the top we have the header. This is just something that is a good practice to keep in mind so you can keep track of the page, so the script name, the version number of the script, the author who wrote the script and the date in which it was last edited, so that it's very clear, these like crucial pieces of information, what the script is it the most up to date, who's in charge of that, or who is the one writing it, and the last time it was updated, right? Just to keep it nice and succinct. You may also want to add page numbers too, but we haven't today, but yes. So the next thing we have is location. So this is something that is a fairly standard practice in traditional script writing. Where we begin our script is in bold, and in capitals we describe whether the location is internal or external, the name of the location, and usually like the time of day. You know, is it daytime, nighttime, twilight, whatever is pertinent to kind of give an initial quick snapshot of where we are in this script. And you may change locations multiple times through the script, but for today we're going to stick to one location. Now, you've got the main body of text here. This could be scene setting, description, so basically anything that isn't dialogue, you're going to want to write it in sort of the main body of text here. So we will go into an example of that below. You can probably see like a little sneak peek at the bottom of the screen there. The next chunk, these three things here, name, parenthetical, and dialogue. This is going to be your dialogue, if you even have dialogue in your script. Some scripts don't even have dialogue. It is simply describing things that are happening. But if you are going to have dialogue, you need to have the name of the character in all capitals. You may want to use a parenthetical, which is essentially direction to either help other people reading it identify the tone. Like if this piece of dialogue is meant to be sarcastic, for instance, it can be difficult to read on paper whether or not a piece of dialogue is sarcastic, so you may want to point that out, especially to performers as well, who may be reading the script for your character. And then of course we have the dialogue, the actual meat and potatoes of what is being said. The other thing to keep in mind is this little bit here. This is specific to games. Now, this may be identifying what level to load into, which level to go to. It could also be signifying what next cinematic might play after this. So, for instance, if you have two cinematics back to back, but maybe they take place in different levels, different locations. However, because your engine that you're using needs to load in between those cinematics, you may want to split these cinematic scripts into two different scripts. So this just helps identify and direct the flow of the game to other people so they understand what comes after this script. Is it another cinematic? Is it a level load? Anything that you feel like is important to the flow of the game. And then of course you just have end, signifying the end of the script. So that's a very brief overview of the kind of things to expect in a basic cinematic cutscene script for games. So let's scroll down here to one that I have filled out. So as we can see at the top, we've given a name for our script, which is Vala's Entrance. It's version 1.0. I find it very important to make sure that you're not just going version 1, 2, 3, 4, because you may run out of numbers very quickly depending on how many times you iterate. So I prefer the sort of 1.0 method, so then you can go version 1.1, 1.2, and it's also very clearly identifiable if you were to maybe say, well, anything that's classed as a version 3 are signed off scripts. So anything with a script named V3 is going to be signed off internally by the team. However, anything before that are usually drafts. You may not work this way, but I have used that in the past as well. It might be something to consider. Obviously, my name and then the date of when it was last updated, so the 25th of June 2025. Now, before we start reading through the actual body of the script, let's have a little look at how many pages we've got. Okay, so we have 1 and a bit pages. Typically, when you're working with scripts, and it depends on how complex the scene actually is, but a finger in the air estimate is 1 page per minute. So by looking at this script here, we've got 1 page and a little bit. We can guess that this is going to be somewhere between 1 minute to a minute and a half. So this is definitely within the brief that we set ourselves of being a minute and a half or less, because as a guesstimate, we're not even reaching halfway down the 2nd page. So hopefully this will all wash out as a minute and a half or below. Now let's look at the location. So we have used EXT as a short form of saying external. So we are outside. For internal, that would be INT, as you probably guessed. So we are outside. We are at the edge of Eliongalis, and it is sundown. Very quick overview of where we are and the time of day. Now, Eliongalis is a weird word. That's because it's a made-up fictional place. So at points, you may feel it necessary to write pronunciation notes for this script. Personally, I would put them in as comments. So adding something as like a comment here, and maybe I say something like, I'm gonna do shorthand there. Pronunciation is L E on Gallus, just to make sure that whoever's reading this, whether it be somebody directing, somebody acting, or anyone else in between, has a very obvious point of reference to pronunciations, especially if you're making up locations, names of places. This could be really helpful later on down the line. All right, so Quiffy, Trickery, Brombolia, and Arctic are surrounded by vine creatures. They have been fighting them off for at least a few minutes and are becoming exhausted. And you may notice that the names Trickery, Quiffy, Brombolia, Arctic, and vine creatures are capitalized. That is because, again, typical standard script writing logic here is that the first instance of naming people, creatures, places, key items, you capitalize them so that it's very clear that here we are introducing a specific thing. These are points of interest. These are people of interest. So these 4 characters and these monsters, we are capitalized here because they are a main focal point and an important point of either the script or the story moving forward. So then we have some text here, some dialogue. So Brombolia, and Brombolia is in all caps because any dialogue that is written is usually in all caps for the dialogue only. So after the first instance of naming characters for the first time on the script, you don't usually fully capitalize them afterwards. So later on down, we will see that renaming people, you just need to use the standard spelling. You don't have to capitalize everything. Anyway, back to the dialogue. Brombolia, out of breath, says, "How many more are there?" Trickery casts a flame spell, burning one of the creatures to a crisp. Trickery, attempting to joke, "Well, that's one less to worry about." Quiffy, "We need to think of something and fast." So we don't need to use a parenthetical every single time. Don't get me wrong, I love a parenthetical. However, you don't want to overdo it. So if you feel as though this line here, which I believe is the case, is not really needing a parenthetical because it's fairly straightforward. We don't need to notify people that these characters are out of breath. We don't need to notify people that this is meant to be a joke rather than it being serious, because otherwise it might be difficult to read it just on the paper as being a joke or serious. This is fairly straightforward, so we don't necessarily need to add a parenthetical. The group of adventurers scan their surroundings for any inspiration until a beam of sunlight glares through the trees and the forest thicket above them. Arctic, "What the?" A team of elven warriors descends on the vine creatures. And notice again, as I mentioned, vine creatures now do not need to be fully capitalized. We've already capitalized them and introduced them to the scene. with a deadly grace. At the helm of this warrior band is a beautiful elven woman riding a large griffin. Lady Sessamaria, destroy the blight. Let nothing live to taint our forest. Vala, protect the strangers. Now, we'll pause here for a second, because in these descriptive moments here and here, these are quite, not basic, but these are quite simple. They don't tell us what colour the hair is of the beautiful elven woman. They don't tell us how many elven warriors descend on the vine creatures. They don't give too much beyond the straightforward, this is what happens. And that is intentional. So for a script, cinematic script, where you're going to have a lot of creative minds piling in and iterating on it, you as a script writer want to highlight the key important information and make sure you set the tone, but you don't want to overdo it, because you're going into the realm of maybe dictating and over-informing on the scene. So when someone comes to work on this script, for instance, like an animator, there's so much going on that they might not understand, or they might not be able to clearly identify what's important in the scene. So we don't want to over-inform here. We want to make sure we're highlighting the best bits. We're wanting to give very clear direction on the things that are important to us, not only to the story, but the way that we believe the scene should be set up, or the way that it should be interacted with. So we don't want to be adding so much fluff. We want this to be a first point of contact. So when we move forward to animating this scene, to acting out this scene, to implementing it in the game, everybody who gets to work on this scene has their creative input to be able to massage and form the best parts of this and elevate it using their own experience. So let's carry on here. Vala, a strong, tall elven woman, darts from seemingly nowhere and lands in front of the adventuring group. They stare in awe as her presence seemed to shine like the sun itself. Now, after I've said that, you might be wondering, this seems very descriptive, Rianne, and it kind of goes against what you just said. And the reason why I put this particular piece in is sometimes you do want to over-inform a little bit because it's pertinent to the scene, because this is her big introduction. So we're leaving these informative moments to when they are most useful, when we really want to nail a particular vision. So instead of it being everywhere, it's very clear that this particular passage is something that is a big, cool moment, and we want to really nail that in the cinematic. She readies her glaive, sprints at the enemy and swings, only to miss. Everyone stares for a beat, the epic build-up instantly dissolving. So the other reason why this is built up so much is to set up the almost joke here afterwards, right? You have this big, grand, epic entrance, and the butt of the joke is she comes in and all of that amazing epicness completely goes to waste because she rolls a nat 1. And we're going to get rid of that double 2 there. Thank you. I don't know actually if Grammarly is coming up for everybody else on this at the moment. Not sponsored, but I do recommend it if you don't have it already. It is very helpful. As you can see, it's showing us all my mistakes. Vala. Shit. The monster swipes at Vala, sending her flying. The rest of the adventuring group snap out of their daze and ready themselves for battle. Transition to combat gameplay, load level forest fight B, and end. So this is the only bit that really pertains to gameplay in this script. That's because this is not an interactive script, this is purely cinematic. However, like I mentioned, you really want to be highlighting the flow of this. So right now, the only thing we want to really concern ourselves with is after this little moment here, we are transitioning back to combat gameplay, and the level that we're loading into is level Forest Fight B. So what we can gain from that is that the flow may be that everybody here in the adventuring party is about to go back into combat, and we maybe want to make that transition as smooth as possible. So whether it's a fade to black and load in, because our particular technical abilities for this game is we can't just transition straight into gameplay by moving the camera behind the playable character, for instance. Maybe it is a fade to black. Maybe it isn't, and maybe it is a thing I said, right? Where the end of this scene, we want to smoothly transition the camera to go behind the playable character that we were playing before this cinematic loads and swiftly go back into the combat gameplay. This is here as a first iteration, right? Because all of this, everything that we have looked at so far in this little script is version 1.0, and everything after this point is going to be reviewing, iteration, and that is when you really start to elevate the script. So your first idea may not be the best, but what you want to do is, for a first version, you want to get all your thoughts onto paper, make it cohesive, and then you're going to review it with your narrative team, with your design team, with your animation team, and make sure that everything that you have suggested works in tandem with the design, technically is actually achievable within the engine that you have, is feasible to make in the time frame that you have. This is not a complex script. However, depending on the engine and depending on your team size, this might actually be a chunk of work that otherwise could be split up or simplified to give your team more time to create more cinematics. So although this captures the initial idea that I had for this scene, the next thing to do is probably, as you've heard the saying go, don't be afraid to kill your darlings, and you do that often. It's very common to go back through a script and review and iterate and review and iterate, and maybe after a few sessions where we get to version 2 or version 3 and we're all signed off, maybe this has changed a lot. Maybe it's only been tweaked to make sure that we haven't missed anything and that everything else is very clear to the rest of the team. But as a first draft, this is fairly standard. So we have just learned how to write our first draft of a cinematic for a video game. Let's go back to not script Rian and the camera version of Rian. There you have it. Now you know how to write and format a simple script used for a cinematic in a video game. In the next video, I will be going over how to write for an interactive scene so we can start understanding the gameplay flow and the logic. Until then, I hope you found this video informative, and don't forget that the resources for today's video can be found in the description down below. Thank you for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time. Bye!